24 sequence lines of pi generate the screen lines adaptation cycles. Taking every data times continuance of no lines of core centers, all files, calculate, modify high levels of space lines of modulation, screen adaptation to service. Recognizing line screen adaptation cycles as all lines of communication to its system. We have to really get into identification settings of high center interference. Humanity is now in line communications of time relapse. Now that puts all communication setting configuration system matrix lines into lines as cores. Has a core line screen adaptation solvables. The cerebral cortex line direct signal has high lines of high volume of activity now, which means the line sequence location is coming into its real reality in set position. No continuance. That puts all communication settings and puts all information setting into all levels of existing all at once of happening in that communication system. So they're going through a role play into a film strip through a projection and set positions all levels, calculating set location to its projector. So that sequence lines the screen lines adaptation setting. So what they did in co-creation line screen adaptations basically brings it forward in travel. Now that comes in all communications setting to its reality. The reality line screen adaptation puts everything in processing. It directs lines, its panels, it opens all communications sight lines, high center location setting, how you see lines, of course, centers, psychonism lines, screen adaptations, or anything of flux. The position location of its reality sets lines of course line. Indirect signals into how we see all communications into real-time zone. So everybody's in a time relapse. My team is in high core centers into all files, interactions, and direct signals, coming into modifications, into graphical screens, into the alphabetical system, all levels of sum that all is. Sending all communications setting and configuration setting to syntax, cortex, and line design lines into high core centers, puts high line division locations into conception. The mind conception line screen adaptations, all levels, come to line position locations and measure through Andromeda, directing lines in line communication setting and travels. This modifies the system locations, how we come into measure, scale, and balance. Known exactly in that position locations, once we come out of the projections in the matrix and outline screen adaptations, it's a psychological reline settings to a relapse and set position of configuration system. The brain really gets in positions to records everything back in tractions, back in zero. The position lines of the processing line direct signals puts everything in calculation settings and grounds. This opens all sequence, opens all panels, opens all communication centers and travel. This puts all communication system all through tractions. Setting lines of course centers puts everything in balance. So we have to understand the measures and the scales now. Now that communication system and all tractions. Welcome everybody to General Spacetime. Getting communication lines at ground centers operate the sequence lines of panels. And as a direct line link in modifications of clockings. Clock line communication setting, all configuration system. So you got 5 position location of time zones. That puts location in your atmospheres. Communications to your hemispheres, stratospheres, bio, and branium. That's all core centers lines of travel. That puts lines of core centers of flux over lines into alpha, into mega, zeta, line core centers in position location alpha. Calculating some high center interference of mega, micro, and macro. Now that has a direct line view that puts all communication system all through calculations. Setting communication high center interference puts all communication to its ground centers and all through travel. Now in that direct signals, we have to understand how to get into digital frame core line centers into our systems, to higher levels of travels, through our connections to our outgoing messages, into input core centers, into output line screen adaptation cycles. The team has just come into higher levels of expansions of who they are. The infinite system, location of travels, and direct modifications. More levels of the mind conceptual location of thought lines. Core lines is triangulation high position location to a system, all through triangulations. Triangulation lines are 3 lines of cycles. Set core lines of travel, endpoint lines of communications. Now, directing lines of order in a 369 panel and position location 9/6 and 3 over lines, provisions over parameters. Directing core centers like communication 0 to 3 centers in line position location measure and scales communication. Now, directing lines of links, process communication ground centers in Merkaba, tesseract, and tetrahedron and travel. Directing signals, we go to the upswing location centers in communication setting and travels in position location to a system. Process calculation ground lines, puts all communications. Setting lines of 4 generation lines of crossing, directing in 4 lines of communication lines of satellites. 4 communication lines of ground centers, over cross location, over line division, over line signals, cross line communications, laser tracks line centers into process communication lines of 0. Communicate ground centers and gravity line screen adaptation to its flux over lines of box frames. See? Box frame. Directing lines of high core centers into box frame data formation screen lines adaptation to the flux over screen over adaptation. process communication centers. Let's open the signals in line screen adaptation to a surface and track location system. 9 lines of sequence, open lines of docking, 3 lines of traction, 6 over lines of measure, and lines of 3 lines of course centers, satellites, modems, Wi-Fi's, and core line centers to its moon base and line rotation surface and track location. Setting direct lines of center, operation system, calculate, modify, and console. Come into the flight navigations and direct signals into all levels of webbing screens. Platforms over screen adaptations of 4 lines of flux into platforms and settings into 4 track locations. Setting communications highest interference and position location to center communications settings and grounds. Operation sequence, line condition setting into digital, line condition earth line tones, position lines of ground line tones into atmosphere lines and magnetic tones in set position. The operation surface and track location line centers opens all signals into center communications setting and travel. Puts all communications setting to the team line sequence or any bit outlines core line screen adaptation with 44 flux. Sets communication high center interference. 30 minutes on track locations. All right, set calculation high setting. Out of the equation. All right, so you guys are on the moon line. Setting communication to its baseline. Now, coming to the configuration system, you guys also have a test on Friday, lines of track center interference, how we come into calculations. This is all as a model. This is all as identification system. It's all like point lines of graph, know exactly what you're seeing through SkyGrid because they all go through SkyGrids. XT1000, subposition XT2000, XJ, and XD. Okay, so we have to understand the modification of its grounds and position of its power and set correlations into its line grids and set position to travel. Okay, sets communicates highest interference in position XT1000 lines of 1, set position XT1000 lines of 2, set lines of high centers of DX. Remember, they're never in position of the same information as ground centers because they're constantly changing their modification system. They're changing the modulators. The modulators puts lines of modules in position lines of travel. They always are in a continuous force in a 4 communication lines of angles and set lines of travel in point lines communication setting and laser grids and set calculations, directing all lines of division. Okay, so you see it in there because it's all balanced, right? So basically what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold up my digital pad and I'm going to get in position locations and get settings. You have to identify what the model is in identifications, where it is in space, where it is modulation, where it is in time sequence, where it's in panel, where it's in operation, where it's in lights, where it's in travel, and where it's in intelligent location to its system, multi-colorations, pathogens, and its metaphors. All right, so let's get in position location travels, 3 lines of signals. What is this in position locations? What is this? What does this look like in travel? What is the direct line length? Remember, it's got 4 lines opening windows, core line centers and ground line, shift line, core lines and compulsors. Calculate and modify impulsory line rotation and cycle. It generates its propulsions. Direct core lines and 4 grounds is set position of sequence over cross location of 3 lines of measure. Scales communication ground lines communication setting, right? So it's a 4-track division. 4 equals lines of X in position lines of T. Set lines of X over 4. Set position. So it's an XT4000. Okay, it's an XT4000. All right. All right. So what puts it in 4 is the windows. All right, so I'm showing the team what they have to come into modification. So it's the data line platform. Here's the data sheet of the inventory. This shows you exactly what model you're dealing with. It's on its PIP and set position. That's the PIP, and that's what it is in traction, all right? So it's a 4-window frame, okay? XT1, X lines of 400 in set position. Puts lines, calculates lines. So fit position location 4 times lines of 10. Sets core lines of highest interference into 4000 sequence. In set correlations, XT4000, okay? So I'm just showing you how you guys get into modification settings. So the test is basically on the models that you come in track location of systems, all right? Because they travel too fast and they go through sequence panels, they go through their traffic, they go through their inventories, they go through their binaries, just like you go through, right? But it's a continuous force, it lines of signals. So if you see an XT1000, changes shape, changes shape, changes shape. That's what it constantly does on a continuous flow in times continuance in set position. So now we're in all time lines all at once, living lines of 8 atmospheres and line screen adaptation with serves. Now we have to understand how to process that in all communications, data files, line conditions, models, and set position notifications. Getting all that communication system all through tracking number. tracking device, communicate the descent lines of core center interference. Now you're going to have information panels of your outposts. That puts all communication in your outgoing messages. An outgoing message is a graph line screen into a lines of set position that's in your system. It's like reading your emails instruction. Okay, coming from an XT, coming from a DX, coming from a one cycle, or a position of a mothership and travel. Okay, 4 signal lines of 1 or 2 and 3 and 4 in track location. All information panels. All right. So we have to get into modifications all through different lines of types and track locations, right, which you're looking at through model. Data file sheets, lines of files, lines of indication system, object and modify in track locations. What is this in setting? Okay, now try to understand the windows and set positions. What is this in setting? What is this? If this is a 2-window frame, what is it in plateau, right? How would you modify this, right? 2 over signal and line settings and crop circles, line track correlates to high setting, position of panel, right? So setting core line settings, this is XT 2000 because it has set position at 2 panels. Okay, that's an XT 2000. So you come across that, you know exactly what it is. So look at the windows, okay, in its settings. Measure scales, lines of dimension lines, and panels. It's that core line communication system that measures its meters and travel, okay, and set position locations. What is this in simple location setting in track line communications? What is this? What does it look like? Look at the lacing line core centers, direct signals. You got to modify the DNA line track locations. So you got 2 lines of perimeter, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, right? It's 6, right? Now, this is a plasma. Set core lines into electrical lines and fusions into core centers in position location and setting. All right. So understanding that, 6 lines of measure equals lines core centers into line position equal lines. Calculate and modify in a plasmoid. Now, a plasmoid, we have plazoids and plazoids. So you have to understand the oids and what it is, a line screen adaptation to a system. Understand the systematic lines of core centers, line connections to a transformation system, all through travel and mechanism locations. So we come in that position locations and setting. Or we have plasdroids, right? Plasdroids, okay, in line communications. Calculate and modify and track communication settings and travel. All right? So 6 lines of measure. So it's 6 equals lines of plasma line. And this location lines of 6,000 line sequence. All right? So I just want you guys to truly understand how this all works. How you see a plasma, anything through oids or location of symbolism lines of track centers, line communications, all those measure scales, and position location to its cycle. And it's all communication setting and travels to all communication setting. XT1000 and set position location to its setting, or XT 30,000. Okay? XT 1000 sets core centers, which has 3 windows. Okay? XT has 2 windows. Sets core line centers high center interference. Now directing signal and modification in one system, one direction, one division, one locations, right? Platforms and communication ground centers, line signal location setting in position of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 set position. XT 30,000, right? Process calculation lines into metric scales in communication ground surface and line position location to its measure. That screen lines its adaptation system all through flux. The core centers and circulatory line communication setting and travel and communications. Okay? So you have to understand simulation track centers. Now, symbol directs its line core centers, how we see lines of core line high center interference of travel into all levels of transmutions, into translations, into all communication in the system, through loss of translation, or loss of the communication system, or interception location to its setting through operation surface. It's all lines of calculation system. Setting lines of 220 line setting line position key equals lines of 7 tractions. During signals and position modification lines of high center interference and locations XT1000, XT4000, XT8000. Platform 2 and platform 6 in travel. Okay? So calculation 1 cycle, set position location in 3 cycles. Remember, they can change their window frames. 4 lines of system and travel and point lines of graph. 1 signal, position of 3 cycles and 4 settings. Okay? So that's 4 lines of symbolisms, into 4 track centers and set calculations, 3 lines of cycles and 3 lines of provision and calculation screen line adaptations, and 1 sibilance and 1 track lines, and 1 communication center and surface and crop circles and traction. Okay? So I got to get you guys to understand these things and how this all works, and speed and acceleration, how they go through their traffic inventories. Remember, you go through the 0 lines of 1 in position 2, in position 3, in position 4. They're constantly changing, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12. Okay? You bring it in, you actually can see it in circulation, right? All number sequence from 0 to 12, right? Change the formations formula, change the ground communication to its system, right? So all it's doing is mutating at different lines of time settings, time sequence, time lines, time all calculate, modify, and time editing. It time edits its space and time's continuance. That's all formation setting core centers. If you get a box frame, in a cubical frame, and track lines, and direct signals and calculations, all through setting. It's a cube, right? Now the cube rotates the system in travel. Okay, see how it comes into 1, into 2? Sending communication lines of 3, and set communication lines of 4 in tractions, right? 4 lines of signals, right? Now if we move it this way, it's in a different direction, right? If we move it this way, it's now in a different direction in 4 sittings, right? And if we can move it this way, it's in set position, right? So 4 tractions in 1 cycle. Sets communication setting and travels in point lines of communications. Directing lines of course centers in position location to a system all through input. Setting course centers high communication setting all lines of travels. Directing in modifications overlapping sequence and set position. Change directions. Look what we got in track location. Platforms. So that's all it is, basically. You know, the teleportation unit, you know how it goes in and out and you see it disappear? It's reshaping its anomaly into deformation setting. Now that coordinates its tractions into its tesseract of center communications, of center operation. Everything has a center operation. So it expands its setting into all of the flux line setting locations, right? Directing in communication ground centers line communication to its system all through travel. Set core lines into communication lines into a stand, a tripod. Opens all signals into modification grounds and set position locations to a satellite. Sets correlation ground lines and symbolism lines of track coordinate centers, open sequence lines of panels, and mechanism location of sonar and position locations measured in higher communications and directions. Sending lines of communication grounds over sequence location system all through lines of sail. Sets communication high center interference in track location to its high center location setting to its ground surface and track location. And this is all through a box frame of what it can do in provision. Seconds over line and direct signals. Now we go through ground line shifts in track communication system all through measure and metric core centers. Directing in modification grounds and calculation modify center lines, center communication, center direct signals of sonar into alpha waves and communication. Sets lines of ground centers, line communications of flux over line and center communications. Nope. Disappeared. It disappeared. Why did it disappear? Because you're not ready to see it through its complete cycle in a 4 line, in 4 provision. I told you, you have to pay attention of speed and how fast it's going. All right, so now you understand how powerful it is where it's off position now, because you don't have a complete cycle of a 4-line system, a circulatory and a rotation lines of surface interactions. All right, that's the importance. You've got to catch it. And the only way to catch it is to slow down your mind in your space of stillness. And then you can see the metric meters. And then you can see the scale. And then you can see the balance in set position and a 4 lines of correlation setting of 4 different angles of 4 different divisions of 4 calculation setting of screen adaptations. All through your binaries, your transistors, and your resistors. All through your inhibitors and the light switches and attractions. Right? If I change the formation ground centers in line communication setting, is it there? Did it leave? No, it's still there. So it's in balance, right? Now we go in a core line screen. Is it there? Still there, right? All right, so we're good. Now, truly understand enough 4 line switch lines of anomalies. Is it there? Good. All right. So we're in a core lines of signals, line direct signals in the opposite set location of time sequence. Is it there? Good. communicate the ground centers into shift lines communication high center interference and modems and Wi-Fi and satellites and towers and communications. Directing in communication ground centers orbiting to directing all communication centers surface in the line direct signals in set position lines of travel. Oh, it's not there. You're not ready to see it. So I have to do it again. You got to have to catch the wind cycles and line communication setting to measure. Is it there or is it gone? Oh, it's gone. So I got to do it again. You see what I mean? Every time I'm doing it, it disappears because you're not ready to see it through frequency. Now you see it. So that's all it is in track location. Okay? Catching in the wind cycles into perimeters is slowing down your space, bending space, modifications of space, editing space, time measures of space, correlation lines of communication lines, trapping space, entrapments of space, escaping through space. There's so many things that you can do in the mind conception once you understand use through allocations. Very powerful, isn't it? What we're all coming into now, especially the team lines of sequence. So let's get into that position location of settings, all through track location lines and different lines of XT1000s. The platitude visual location of settings. Okay. So remember, it's constantly going to be changing, but to actually see what it is, you have to slow down your space. All right. You slow down your space, they're in position locations. You speed up the space, you don't see it in measure. You don't see it in scale. You don't see it in balance. And you definitely don't see it in modification of transformation of travel. Okay, so it's true to understand that it's all through window frames. You get a position lines of one cycle, in position locations of 2 cycles, and we get position lines of 3 cycles, 3 window frames in track locations, XD1, XD2, XD3. That's how easy it is in platform, all right? But remember, they're constantly morphing. Right? So you have to catch the wind cycles of their systems all through time sequence of time editing and time panels of clocking, because they're constantly changing their clocking systems in 4 settings into 4 settings of grounds. Okay, 4 settings up in signal in set position and 4 setting cross locations in set position. Okay, and then they morph into a circulation rotation of a different orb or a different project or a different line sequence or different correlations or a different number sequence. They change into anything. See, the one thing you guys have to understand, when you come into position locations, 1 times 1 is 1, but 1 is never 1. So it's just mutations in 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track, and sometimes continuance. That keeps morphing. So if you want to see it, you got to slow down your space so you can actually see it where it is in teleportation of its system and understand where it is its model through its identification cycle. And then you can see the data file. Open up the file. You know what it is, right? Now it can be a 24,000 file. It could be a 1,000 file. It can be 5,000 files. It could be 1 file. It all depends where it is in track location you measured. That scales its communication system all through adaptation of surface. Okay? Very complicated, but it's a lot of fun. All right. Setting sequence lines of panels is a direct lines of modification grounds. Now get in that position location system. You just have to understand the different model types. Let's start with this. Let's go with this. Let's start with this. Okay? And then it gets more complicated when you go into circuitry. Higher levels of teleportations. Okay, there's always a center in everything that you see in travel, which is its power generated. Everything is a power generator. It operates its system, right? But everything also has its flux. Everything also has its flux. It doesn't matter what unit it is in position, location, and setting. All right. So you have to truly understand how this all works and all communicates through a system in travel. Okay. Scales communication grounds and communication setting in colossal. Core lines, communication lines of flux lines, and set lines of travel and communications. Different lines of units in set position. Different lines of teleportation settings in track locations. Different levels of space modification systems, all levels of time sequence of clockings, guys. Everything has its own model, right? But it's constantly changing its form. You have to basically catch it in set position to its setting. And that's why you see everything through a star of mechanism. Okay? So what you're looking at is a Merkaba. You see it as a star, but it's not a star. It's just changing its formations of time sequence in time's continuum of its dimension of what it wants to come into of the next shape in set position. Setting lines of core centers into center operation to high lines of communication setting of flux changes all communication centers over operation surface interaction. Okay? Now, you've probably already seen that in specifications. But that's all it is, really. You just have to understand how to use it in position of its files and its data. Understand what this process is. There it is on its bit. Now, the pip shows you the program lines of in total location setting of its placements. Puts all communication ground centers, lines of surface, and track location system. You're seeing orbs. You're seeing X2000s. Okay? So even if a star line screen adaptation of settings are Merkaba and tesseract and communication setting of service and track locations, right? But everything has a center line. Everything has to have a center line because that propels its system location into its flux and setting. Okay? Setting lines of grounds, powers, and atmospheres in location setting to its light and track location. Okay? Sets off the signals in position locations your inhibitors. Inhibitors, lines, and screen lines adaptation of a surface that opens all attraction correlates setting. How do you see it through models, identification set locations? Get an indication systems of arrows going in each direction in that track locations. All right. Mechanism lines on one center in position of two factors over line, lines of E factors over screen over adaptations, right? All through mutations, right? Let's change the view. There it is in different lines of sequence with different formula, different equation, right? Different angles and line screen adaptations of models identifications, different files and track correlations, different divisions, different levels of space and track lines of communication to its setting. Okay? So everything has a center core. Everything has a mechanisms of a core. Everything has a triangulations of a core. So every time you change information, it's changing its grounds, its powers, and its atmospheres. That's all it is on a 4-line signal into north, east, west, and south. Okay, different angles, different point lines of graph, and communication system all through travel. Okay, amazing stuff. Circuitry lines, changing course centers of travel. Circuitry lines, energetic dome screen locations, lines of high center interference location of travel. Okay, so everything has to have a circulation rotation of center operation of its surface. That sets a relay program is center communication of flux line and screen line adaptation setting of process calculations. Hooah. Setting lines of direct signals in different lines of travel. Okay, look at that. See? Oh, look at that. It looks like an airplane. All right, so everything has assembling lines of plazoid coral centers into all communication setting and position location of the system. So everything has a plasma setting location that protects its system. All through electrical lines of grounds. Now, diffusion lines of 1. 3 symbolism lines of 3 track locations, all right? Now, waving center line condition setting, 3 panels, XT1000 platitude screen adaptation of its surface tractions. Changing at a different angle, look what you have in traction. All right? See how you see it in different angles, right? Once you understand the game of patterns of recognition, you understand how it is. Like I said, to understand how not to beat a game, but understand the pattern recognitions of a game. You understand the strategic location, how a game is worked in processing. Understand the levels of the game, the players of the game, and the characters of the game itself. Is understanding the 4 sequence of panels and lines of communication system, how calculations modify. All right, setting lines of track coordinates and height positions. Let's get in orbs, how they come into sizzle. There's an orb lines and 2 orbs communication setting. 1 metric meters, scales lines of communications, right? Comes in symbolism, line communications, over cross line signals, over cross lines of communication lines, orb, right? Gets in position location to settings into the ground. That's what happens, right? So it plays out the audio line screen adaptation of the pi. Sonar lines, set line position location to its measure, and scale communicates to its system. The all track lines, high centers as center lines, position lines as processing communicates to its tubing. Process communicates high center interference, line position location to its measure, and scales and communication to its Merkaba. Let's bring in a higher lines of signal. There it is in line position, right? See the intelligence in the position? There's the intelligence monitoring the system inside the orb, right? Everything has lines of high center interference, has lines of tractions and direct signals into position location to its setting, to its antenna. Sets communication, sets calculations. Turns on the light bulb sequence, 1, position, 2, 3, or 4 lines of signal, right? Light signals it up. Line rotation surface and direct correlates and high center interference as center communications. Bring it out signal, process communication grounds, and center lines of surface track locations. Different lines of correlations. Ground center lines of 1, ground center lines of 2, and position lines of 3 over lines over pi, center core system, energetic line screens, adaptation of surface interactions. So that's communication high center interference. Remember, you got to use line communication setting high positions. Note exactly what's going in the sky grids in line screen adaptation as traffic. Okay, center core centers and line position. Okay, getting that communication grounds, understand your powers in the atmospheres. 3 lines of signals, 1, 2, 3 lines of processing, right? Position lines of flux, over lines, equal lines of 1 box, 1 triangulation, 1 Fibonacci, 1 centers in box, 2 frames, 2 data formation lines, energetic graph screens into data processing, Schumann resonance, and line direct signals in alpha. Okay, now you take that line screen adaptations into a box frame, okay, to a data sheet. The XC1000s are where you are in platform inline rotation surface picks it up in location setting. Process lines of direct signals, data processing line 1, open signals, open panel, open traction, open division. Data file sequence lines of course centers of 2 box frames in set core system into a window frame into line position of kaleidoscope. Oh, it's not there, right? It was there, now it's not there. You're not ready to see it. Let's do it again. Is it there or is it not there? Oh, it's there, so we're in balance. So everything that you see off signal has to be in balance. If it's off balance, you're off balance in the mind of conception of speed, and understand that through acceleration is understanding that through the traffic of your inventories, know exactly what's going on in your space modulation settings into your modification system all through travel. Triangulate line centers lines in XT1000 into flux over 3. Set position of 3 over 6 into modification lines of 9 tractions, 10 line division, 11 cycles, 12 line center interference, 13 line rotations, 14 lines of measures, and box frame communication. Is it there? Nope. What's missing in travel? So we have to understand that high core centers line communications, high center interference. Set core lines of 10 over 11 over 12. Sets lines of triangulation flux over line. Directing lines of 14 lines of measure and scale communication grounds, 14 lines of cycles, line direct signals and modification centers into open sequence, into a model of communication system, all through track lines, XT14000. Right here at the ground setting. Setting communicates high center interference, puts lines of course centers in position location to its setting, all through an umbrella. Directing in modification grounds, in line communication to hieroglyphics and high lines of travel. Directing signals high core centers of tubings, 2 track location, 1 provision. Cross line signals, process lines at 3 over 6 over line, identification cross line settings, and high operation surface and set position. Still there, right? Process lines into box frame, into set position location system, all through Saturn, and track location to a system, all through calculations. Hoo-ah! Done by equation. Okay? Very powerful when you understand these things. So getting into your letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols puts the traffic inventory to your binary. Recourse centers, line communication setting, and metric course centers. If you get direct signals into lines of dark web, now process, you got to be very careful what you're doing through directions. You got a dark web, setting signals, location setting, and processing, directing signals. Here's the webbing system and calculations. All right, setting the webbing system lines of travel. Okay, that's your webbing system, right? All right, so an XT1000 comes in, applied to your systems, knows exactly what's going in signal, goes in center communications. Directing in modification of 3 lines of flux and travel. Okay? Now, symbolism lines of track core line set as sonar, sets lines of dark web, and 3 lines of tractions. All right? Directing core centers, line condition setting that changes the motivation system and all lines of its activity and rotation surface in a screen line adaptation line position location to its measure. Scales its balance into position lines of dark, overline sequence, equals lines of coordinate lines of laser grids, Skynet lines and balance lines into all levels, all in position location to its system and tractions. Now, change it line screen adaptations. What do we have in screen adaptation to its cycle? Higher lines of communications. Direct lines over cross location of screen lines adaptations of flux. Process lines of platforms 1, 2, 3, and 4 settings of travel. Process line signal lines, high interference. What do we have in set position location to a system? Pyramid and track location. Core centers, line direct signals into 4-line sequence, into 4 lines of flux over a line screen, into direct inline communication to redirect. Directing lines, core centers of dark web, light web, and symbolism line core centers. 100 lines of measure, scales communication lines of seconds, minutes, and hours in rotation surface and center communication. It's all there in tractions, right? Let's go on a ground line surface. What do we have in center location of 4 platforms? Directing core line settings and alignment measures. Let's scale the communication system all through travel. Changing direct signals into lines across screens. 4 lines of measures and scales communication lines of laser and track location. Communicate to high center interference line position location to a system through its traffic of its inventory and set position. Cross line settings, open all sequence location to a system. Measure scales its laser line track center interference in a 45 split lines of anomaly and line screen adaptation to a setting. Okay, open sequence, open panels, open tractions. All right, so you just have to basically understand how to use the dark web and the light web. So it has a balanced location setting. You can overcross line screens, you can copy and paste, you have to MLN, you have to enabled, you have to get into default, you have to get into embedded to really understand how to use your light and your dark webs, your binaries that relines this communication setting. If you get a flux line screen, 4 settings of 4 line cycles and 3 lines of measure. Scales position XT1001, XT1002, and XT1003, right? So that's 1 symbolism, 2 track lines of 3 line cycles, sets communication high settings in between lines, 2 lines of track location of 3 settings. Now, if you change the communication lines of surface, it changes communications of direction. So that's all it is. It's 4 lines of signals changing its directions of mutation, right? Sets communication high centers and ground centers. Here we have a line rotation surface and line position location to a system that changes all levels of face recognition. See the face? Face recognition of time sequence comes into panels. 4 lines of track centers into all levels of communication system all through travel. Oh, animated configuration system of time sequence. All right, so at ground centers, line signals and modifications, lines of animation system location. Ground center lines of 1, XT1000, XT4000, and plateau. Process calculation ground centers. Process lines of 1 sysline, 4 tractions, 4 division locations, open sequence, open panels. Metric course centers in platforms in 3 lines of measure in 4 set position. Scales position lines, open wigno, open signal, and line position energetic dome screens. Indirect signals of flux lines in position location and settings, all through communications, like a sprinkler that comes out of its webbing system and all through calculation lines of time reactors and track location. Hoo-ah. Change the communication grounds, sets lines, communication high center interference, and position location to its setting. Okay. Coming to all communication lines is spider up and track location. See the spider? All right. So I'm trying to get you guys understanding things. Once you understand travel mechanisms, everything gets a lot more easier through times continuance or no continuance to all continuance. Once we understand how to modify that, then we can change our communication lines. Directing lines of moon, process lines of divots, over cross locations, process lines, circulation lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 6, process lines of 8 in position. All right. Change simplest lines of track calculation lines of 1 level, 1 traction, 1 division. Course centers, process lines, and solar generation screen lines adaptation, process lines of setting. Symbolism line cross location setting and process lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of measure of scanner. Core lines of calculation screen lines adaptation of flux over setting over lines to screen adaptations in position of flywheel and 8 signals in set position. Platform lines of high centers puts all communication system to higher lines of travels. So all it is I'm changing the position of its setting of its XT1000 to an XT4000, XT3000 travel. Just changing its shape and set position. All right, taking the moon base, line out traction of team line sequence in 144 observation screen. Directing in modification ground centers. Take them out of the equation. Close panel, you guys are back in tractions. All right, setting lines of course centers, XT1001 platform, data sheets process lines of 1, data sheets process lines of 2 panels and tractions. Directing course centers, laser tractions, indirect signals. Cross locations, high center interference, line direct signal location of the system. Now we upswing the core centers that puts all ground communication lines of its fencing and lines of panels. Process lines of symbolism, cross locations, indirect signals. Platforms lines of 1 and track location. Process over cross location of string lines and adaptation of settings. Gain communication high center interference of ground symbolism, cross location system all through travel. Okay. Now you have platforms 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 6, and 8 in travel and communications. Directing signals into all levels of graph communication setting. Process lines into data formation lines of Schumann resonance and track location. Gets lines of the grounds, get lines in the panels, and position the atmospheres in travel and communication, right? Core lines of symbol location settings and central communication of centuries. Line communication settings of decades, and all communications of millennium. Process lines of 1, process lines of 3, process lines of 6, and process line calculation lines of high setting. Communicate the ground centers of flux and core centers and line position location to a system, all through its track location, the high center position location to a system, and high formation line grounds and high correlation line rotation surface in its planetary surface and track location. Okay. So getting in that position location and settings gets you to basically understand how to use that and measure and scale and balance and everything through all levels. But you have to get in position locations, how to really get into lines, how to identify different lines and modifications, identifications of notification setting that's verified and confirmed in positions and Hall cycles. So each one has a high setting. You have a low grounds, intermediation settings, or high grounds into low frequency. Setting core centers low vibrations or anything in track communications, right? Understanding into volume of XT in position locations, all levels at different lines of calculations. Different model here, data processing, 3 files and tractions. You know what it is. Process here, line direct signals, you know what it is, in 6 lines of files and traction. And you know what it is in line position location of 4 lines of tractions into 15,000 lines of files and traction. All through different lines of high center interference and direct signals, okay? Through an XT1000 to an XT3000 and XT14000. In all position that comes in its files right here in set positions. That's why it's very important to get into your outgoing mail in set position. All right, so how's everybody doing so far? Are we all confused now more than ever? Why it's so important to basically slow down your space so you know exactly what you're up against, you know exactly what they're changing into in set position, their timelines and times continuance, to know all files are continuance. Getting in that communication setting puts all levels of realities in high position locations and all track lines of communication settings. You get in position lines of balance, you're good to go. You don't get in position lines of balance, you're in relapse. So it's very important what you're doing in provision lines of cycles and track location to setting. Okay? All right. Setting core centers, high position locations. See you guys in 5. Goof.